back to a history class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of the rise of the market economy from about 1820 to 1860. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about urbanization and one of the key elements of urbanization in this era, which was immigration. In the previous lecture, we talked about the rise of factories in this era, and particularly the Lowell mills. But even within the growing and large cities, the rise of factories was a key element of life in that period, and factories churned out a vast array of goods during this time, from clothing and hats to tools, furniture, machines, books, musical instruments, and all kinds of other things. I also mentioned briefly in the previous lecture that we see workers in this era at times starting to organize and come together, not exactly as unions just yet, but they recognize that one of their sources of power and influence is their bodies and their labor itself. And so if they walk out on strike, they might be able to make changes. And that was the case in 1835 when about 20,000 workers in Philadelphia walked out from a number of different factories and jobs, demanding, among other things, a 10-hour workday, which ultimately they were successful in getting, and that then became the standard workday around the country. So we don't see a whole lot of this kind of activity just yet, and we don't have labor unions just yet, but we are seeing occasionally workers walking out, and in this case, demanding and getting improved conditions. We're also seeing tremendous growth in the cities during this time. Cities boomed around commercial centers like New York or Boston. They boomed around transportation hubs like St. Louis, or Cleveland, or Chicago. And also we've already talked about some industrial towns like Lowell, Massachusetts, or Wilmington, Maryland. And there are many others like Cincinnati, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and so on. In every case, the growth of cities meant a new kind of lifestyle for many Americans. First of all, the cities brought with them a new kind of hustle and bustle. There were shops and restaurants and entertainment. But cities in that era were not as adept as modern cities at dealing with things like garbage, sewage, and the needs of its citizens. And so there's also kind of a darker, seedier side that comes with the rise of cities, like crime, poverty, and homelessness. And over time, local governments would have to learn and develop methods for handling those kind of problems. We also see in the growth of cities the beginnings of a new middle class. And while most of the population still makes a living with their muscles, a growing middle class makes a living with their brains. We see growing numbers of managers, shop owners, professionals like teachers, lawyers, and clerks that don't quite live like the upper classes, but are developing a solid middle class living. And in their homes you might find new amenities like iron cook stoves, lamps, bathing stands, and so on. We also see by the middle of the century many of these cities are becoming too large to be considered walking cities, which in the early 1800s, most cities you could get to wherever you needed to go within a few hours just by walking. But more and more the urban centers are sprawling, and as described in previous lectures with the rise of factories, more people are living at a distance from where they work. So they have to have transportation. And we're starting to see more cities introducing what we might call public transportation or transportation for groups, beginning with something called the omnibus, which we see here, an urban stagecoach. This would be pulled by horses, carrying a dozen or so passengers. And eventually that evolves into the horse car, which is a similar idea, but it would be on tracks or on rails. And thus it was smoother and easier for the horses to pull. You could put more people in each car. The population in these growing cities was increasingly made up of immigrants. We're not quite to the huge waves of immigrants that we see come in the 1880s and 90s, but by the 1840s and 50s we do start to see growing waves of immigrants coming into the country. In the 1820s, some 125,000 or so foreigners came to the United States. By the 1850s, that number is closer to 2.8 million. Some were driven to emigrate by terrible conditions in their homelands, like the Irish potato famine that we'll discuss shortly. Others migrated for issues of freedom, war, disease, or other reasons. The first group to make this journey in huge numbers was the Irish. Their flight was one of necessity, and over this period they see a severe population loss in the homeland itself. In 1841, the population in Ireland was about 8.2 million. By 1891, that population is cut nearly in half to 4.7 million. Of that number, many died. This is the period of the potato famine, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But many others migrated, not always to the United States, but between 1820 and 1930, about 4.5 million Irish immigrated. And they were always a huge percentage of all immigrants to the United States in the period that we're discussing. Between 1820 and 1860, in each year, Irish make up between 30 and 50% of all immigrants coming in. We can also talk about their immigration in three different periods, from 1820 to 1844 before the famine, then the peak years of the famine itself, 1844 to 1855, and then post-famine from 1855 through the 1930s, which we're not going to be as concerned about in this lecture. So while we associate Irish immigration primarily with the years of the famine, even before the potato famine, about 1 million Irish had immigrated to the United States, but for different reasons than we'll see during the famine years. The population in Ireland was booming between 1791 and 1841, but this actually led to a scarcity of land and resources, which was compounded by the English landlords who controlled Ireland at that time, who were more inclined to raise cattle and push more and more of the Irish off of their land. So many of them had no recourse but to try to leave. So this early period of Irish immigration involved mostly males immigrating. We're not seeing as many families yet. And many of them sought work in the British lumber trade. They could find ships in Ireland that would take them across, usually starting in Canada. That's where the lumber trade was most prominent, and then working their way south from there, many of them ultimately reaching the United States. This is part of why when we think even today of a city that might be particularly Irish in its inclination, we might think of Boston. You think of the Boston Celtics, for instance. By 1880, 75% of Boston's foreign-born population was Irish, and at that time there were about 65,000 Irish in the city. So most of these Irish immigrants found work in manual labor, building canals and roads, bridges, sewers, and eventually the railroads as well, which you see in this picture. Now, some Irish women migrated as well, occasionally with families, but at times some single women migrating during this period, intending to make a little money, some connections, maybe improve their situation, like a young woman named Margaret McCarthy, who wrote home to her father in 1850, saying, "My dear father, any man or woman are fools that would not venture and come to this plentiful country, where no man or woman ever hungered or ever will, and where you will not be seen naked." So many of these single women ended up taking work in domestic service as housemaids and so on. And this actually becomes something of a cliche. But it did provide a genuine opportunity to these Irish women who, as described in that quote, back in the homeland, had very little opportunity and might wind up starving and without even clothing. So these women found a variety of opportunities in the United States, the first of which was money. This kind of work paid much better than what they would typically find in their homeland. It was also safer for them. It offered them a chance to learn about America and become accustomed to American society. It offered them shelter from the hectic city life and kept them off the streets. At the same time, in the midst of being surrounded by people, many of them complained of loneliness, as one who wrote, "Ladies wonder how their girls can complain of loneliness in a house full of people. But oh, it's the worst kind of loneliness. Their share is but the work of the house. They do not share in the pleasures and delights of the home." Now, the peak of Irish migration came during the years of the infamous potato famine between 1844 and 1855. About 1.5 million Irish immigrated during that period, and more people left Ireland in those 11 years than in all of its previous recorded history. It started in October 1845, when the Irish potato crop that supported the masses of peasants was afflicted with a fungus known as the blight. As one person wrote, the air was laden with a sickly odor of decay, as if the hand of death had stricken the potato field, and everything growing in it was rotten. Now, the potato, of course, was the primary sustenance for Irish during that time. And as the years went on, each successive year the potato crop got worse and worse because they ended up having to eat even what they would normally use as seed for the following year. And so the famine just grew worse and worse. The population was growing weakened by disease, and eventually they had little recourse but to leave. The British government did nothing to help those in need, and in fact continued their very harsh practices, driving even more Irish off of their land. And by 1851, between 1 million and 1.5 million Irish had died, and so many of them had to try to seek shelter by migrating to the United States. Most of the Irish who arrived settled in the eastern cities of the United States, typically the Northeast, and worked in manual labor positions. There are instances of Irish migrating to the South, and in some cases, large numbers of Irish were hired to fill jobs that were thought to be too dangerous even to risk slave labor. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But as one example, in New Orleans, digging the new canal, some of you might be familiar with Canal Street in New Orleans, and we talked in the previous lecture about the prominence of canals. In the 1830s, the new canal in New Orleans was dug almost exclusively by Irish labor. And there was a poem written about this. 10,000 micks they swung their picks to dig the new canal, but the cholera was stronger than they, and twice it killed them all. So they're dying of cholera. Whether 20,000 of them died or not is impossible to say, but many of them did. During this era, the Irish really struggled to establish themselves and create an identity. They were often characterized by whites already living in the States as beastly and brutish, and often associated with vices such as drinking, gambling, and laziness. They were also often compared with blacks, and when we look at cartoons of this era, it's hard to distinguish sometimes between the two because they were working manual labor and often dirty. They also often competed for the same jobs with blacks, and so a considerable animosity developed between the two groups. Irish ultimately opposed suffrage and equality for blacks because they would be the first whites to lose out on their jobs if the blacks gained. And this is just one more cartoon representing the struggles of the Irish to really fit in and be welcomed, while you see a number of other immigrant groups kind of being welcomed into the pot of citizenship, the so-called melting pot. The Irishman is left on the outside, just kind of screaming and ranting to be welcomed in.